Greetings and welcome to another lecture in Introductory Psychology. This one is a short introduction to the various theories of emotion, past and present. Now, I do want to warn you that this is not a very good lecture to be watching on a phone, simply because I'm going to be using figures and such, and it will be very difficult to see them. It's going to be kind of difficult to see them actually on a regular computer screen. So if you're watching on a phone, I would suggest you find yourself a computer screen, or if you have the Cicerellian white text, you can turn to the appropriate figure, figure 811, comparison of theories of emotion, or find something similar in a textbook or online that you can look at while you listen. Now, I use this diagram because I like it. It lays out all of the theories of emotion in nice ways so you can look at and compare and contrast them, so that you can tell exactly, sort of see where they are the same and see where they differ. Now, the first theory is called the common sense theory, so called because if you asked people to describe emotion, this is what they would say happens. There is something nasty, in this case, a German Shepherd that looks very unhappy, and the common sense says the first thing that happens is you feel the emotion. The emotion kicks in, and that the emotion causes your autonomic nervous system. That's ANS, autonomic nervous system. It causes your autonomic nervous system to kick in with the fight or flight response. That's delightful, except it doesn't work like that. There's been enough very close examinations of people's actual physiological responses to emotions, and what they found actually is that the autonomic nervous system arousal tends to come first. It tends to come before the emotion, in fact, which is rather odd, but it gives us the James-Lange Theory. The James-Lange Theory says that, okay then, okay, we'll work with it. Remember, theories have to take into account reality as we know it. So the James-Lange Theory says, okay, here we have a vicious dog. What happens first of all is the autonomic nervous system kicks in, which causes changes in the body, and that these changes are different for every emotion. Because the idea is that we can tell what emotion we are feeling by what our body is doing, by how our body is reacting. That anger feels like this, and fear feels like that, and happiness feels like this, and surprise feels like that. And so therefore we can tell by what our body is doing what emotion we're feeling. The big problem with that is that when you measure the body's reactions physiologically, it's extremely difficult to tell the difference between these emotions. They all pretty much look the same. And any report that people have that it feels different may indeed be due to the environment that they find themselves in. And there's actually a theory involving that, which I'll get to in the next slide. So the James-Lange Theory is a little shaky, if you pardon the expression, given that this person is afraid because they're shaking, simply because we haven't found really good evidence for it. On the other hand, there's some aspects of it that may indeed be accurate. The best evidence we may have found for the facial feedback theory may be something along, for the James-Lange Theory, may be something along the lines of the facial feedback theory, which is also in the next slide. In the facial feedback theory, we get an idea of what our emotions are by what our facial expressions are doing. More about that later. Thirdly, we have the Canon-Bard theory. Now, the Canon-Bard theory says that what happens when there is something in the environment, for instance, that frightens us, is that portions of our brain, probably the hypothalamus, since it's involved in all of those things, or perhaps parts of the hindbrain or even the midbrain, essentially tell both the autonomic nervous system and the amygdala in terms of emotion to feel that emotion. That basically we get the autonomic nervous system arousal and the fear at the exact same time, so that there is no delay between the two. And as I mentioned, that isn't so. We actually know that the autonomic nervous system arousal does come before the fear, so we're just going to leave the Canon-Bard theory behind and let it sit kind of right there. Now we're getting to the more recent ones, and the ones in which we have somewhat better evidence for, with the studies that have been done. I'm actually going to jump to the facial feedback theory, because as I mentioned, this may be one of the parts of the James-Lange theory that may be accurate, although I also want to mention that facial feedback is probably not sufficient in and of itself to give us an emotion, but it may highlight the emotions that we are indeed feeling. So, facial feedback theory says we have a vicious dog. What happens is part of the autonomic nervous system arousal that we have leads to facial expressions. Okay? We have facial expressions here. And that the facial expressions that come with emotions, and we know they come automatically. There's actually been some work looking at using facial expressions, particularly very, very quick one called micro expressions, using them as lie detectors. Because although you can mask your facial expression, it's almost impossible to completely mask a little tiny flash of what you're actually feeling before you can slam the mask down. And so the idea is that somehow our facial expression then helps increase what it is that we are feeling, which is kind of James-Lange, if you think about it. But Schachter-Singer cognitive arousal theory, or what I've also heard called the Schachter two-factor theory, which has a nice rhyme to it. This one's kind of interesting because it says, okay, we got cognitive in there. Keep that in mind. Cognition means thinking. We have a vicious dog. So what happens is our autonomic nervous system kicks in. It tells us that we're feeling an emotion. How do we know what emotion we're feeling? We look to our environment. We look to our environment. We look here, we see there's a vicious dog. Therefore, the emotion that we're feeling must be fear. Bingo, fear. Or, if instead of a snarly dog, you have the love of your life come walking in the room. The love of your life comes walking in the room. All of a sudden, your heart pounds, you start sweating and perhaps trembling. Your autonomic nervous system is kicking in. You say, oh, I mean, this is not a conscious saying, oh, I'm going to look around and see what it is. But this is, on some level, you're thinking, okay, it's an emotion. What is it? It's the love of my life. I must be happy. And therefore, you feel happy. So we have to look to our environment to tell what it is that we are feeling. And if the environment gives us no clues as to what we're feeling, we don't know what to feel. This is kind of interesting when you think about it. And there's actually been some studies where people have had their autonomic nervous system, for instance, thrown into gear without them knowing about it. And what they've often found is, if you take somebody and you somehow throw their autonomic nervous system into gear without them knowing about it, usually using some kind of trick application of something like adrenaline that kicks in the fight or flight response, you will often find that people will change their emotion to match any people that they are with. If they're with people who are happy, when that switch is flipped, they become happier. If there were people who are unhappy, when that switch is flipped, they become unhappy. I'm sometimes reminded, when I read about this or think about it, of the fact that with small children, very often, when something bad happens, they're running and they fall down. They don't know how to react. They know they should react somehow, right? Because their autonomic nervous system is kicking in, and they know that they need to react, but they don't know how. So they look to the people around them. And if their mother or their father is freaking out and crying and rushing toward them and everything else, the child is going to become afraid and is going to start freaking out and running around and crying themselves. But on the other hand, if the parent just kind of ignores it very often, or maybe even the parent kind of giggles a little bit because the kid fell down. Now, we're not assuming that there's broken bones and bleeding or anything here. But, kids falling down are kind of funny. If you've ever watched America's Funniest Home Videos, there's a lot of kids falling down. And so maybe when the parents are kind of giggling or the people around them are giggling, the child will also start laughing. They look to their environment to see how they should react. And the Schachter-Singer theory says that we look to our environment to see what it is that we're feeling, that we simply cannot tell by what our body is reacting, what we are feeling. Now, this also, as you can see, is sort of with the facial feedback because we're cognitively interpreting what our face is doing, which helps tell us what we're feeling. It may be that facial expressions are indeed one of those very elusive instincts that we're always talking about, because facial expressions are universal. Every human in the world smiles when they're happy and frowns when they're not. Now, not every human may show those facial expressions. There are different rules about when you're allowed to show and not allowed to show facial expressions. They're called display rules. But everybody's face reacts the same way. It could be that's an instinct. It could also be that it's a reflex, since there is a fine line. Now, Lazarus's cognitive mediational theory is similar to Schachter-Singer's cognitive arousal theory. The idea here is that we have to determine whether or not something is a threat on that same sort of subconscious cognitive level before we will feel the emotion. So what happens is we have perhaps some bodily responses. We look and we say, oh my goodness, that's a bad thing, and so therefore our body reacts. So in some ways, Lazarus's is almost kind of a throwback to the common sense. I mean, it's Schachter Singer seems to be the one that has the most evidence these days. But like many things in psychology, many things in science for that matter, we can't nail it down. It may be that one of these is true. It may be that none of these are true. But at the moment, it looks like the one that best matches the evidence that we have as to what really happens in the real world seems to be Schachter Singer, with maybe a quick follow-up of the facial feedback and Lazarus's cognitive mediational theory.